Good afternoon. Welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. Our main story today looks at Srebrenica. It's nearly 20 years since the genocide which shook that town. Commemorations have begun in the UK today with a memorial service to remember the victims. Afzal Ahmed has this report.
Behind me here, hundreds of specially invited guests have arrived for Srebrenica Memorial Day to mark the massacre of more than 8,000 Muslim boys and men in Bosnia in July 1995. Organised by Remembering Srebrenica, it was attended by genocide survivors and Srebrenica mothers who lost husbands, sons, fathers and brothers in the atrocity. The President of Bosnia-Herzegovina was also present along with a long list of UK MPs and dignitaries. 20 candles were lit in memory for the victims and to give a strong message that one of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century will never be forgotten. This was echoed by some survivors who say the wounds were still as fresh now as it was 20 years ago and closure was still out of reach.
Porodica žrtava genocida nakon 20 godina rane nisu zarasle niti kad mogu zarasti dok se svi naši ne pronađu.
As the mother and as mothers of the victims of genocide, we are here to commemorate and know our wounds have not healed. They can never heal, not until we have found all those who have perished on that fateful day.
These days they are talking about a resolution on genocide in Srebrenica, and we have some states in Europe who are against that resolution, who cannot accept it that in Srebrenica was a genocide.
The message this year is a united front against hatred and intolerance to prevent any future atrocities taking place. Prime Minister David Cameron led tributes ahead of the Westminster service, saying people must never ever forget what happened. However, with the rise in anti-Muslim prejudice and a shift to the right in Europe in recent years, some have echoed caution to whether Europe is still safe.
I think it's obvious that evil is always just slightly below the surface, and we know the old saying, all it takes is for good men and women not to remain silent. Therefore, remembering is making sure we're not silent. Hearing the stories means that we are not silent. Taking people on visits means that we are not silent, and that keeps the legacy alive, which means that we are constantly warned that when hate crime gets out of control, it can lead to the tragic circumstances that we saw in the genocide 20 years ago.
The events of Srebrenica happened during the Balkans conflict between 1992 and 1995. What was supposed to be a safe area under the watch of the United Nations, it was captured by Bosnian Serb forces under the command of General Ratko Mladic. In July 1995, Mladic and his men systematically killed more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys who were then buried in mass graves. It was the greatest atrocity on European soil since the Holocaust. To this day, many survivors and the family members of the fallen still search for the bodies of their loved ones. Afzal Ahmed, The Report.
Well, joining me to discuss this are independent researcher Nasir Choudhry and Alex MacDonald, who writes for the Middle East Eye. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Nasir, is there something that makes this loss of life, which would be horrible under any circumstances, more striking to us because it happened under the eyes, if you like, of a peacekeeping force, the Dutch troops that were there?
Yes, it's very striking. In fact, Srebrenica is only one of many what were at the time UN safe havens in Bosnia, but Srebrenica is described by many as being iconic of what happened throughout Bosnia, but particularly because this genocide, as you say, occurred under the Srebrenica being at the time under the control of the United Nations forces, which were supplied at that time by the Dutch government. It's iconic because in a single word, if I were to describe Srebrenica, you might use the word genocide, and that's quite accurate, but I would also use the word deception. And I think it was iconic of the deception that happened throughout Bosnia. The atrocities in Bosnia against the Muslims went on for some 3.5 years, whilst the international communities, including ourselves, the US, the UN, just argued about what they could and couldn't do, and then decided not to do anything except provide UN people on the ground. And when they decided to put UN people into Srebrenica, they suggested something like 30,000 people would be required, or UN soldiers would be required. At the time of the atrocities, you might be surprised to know that there was something like 300, and they were expected to protect the Muslim community. Not only that, when they did get the UN Charter, which allowed them to go there and protect the people, required the Muslims to lay down their weapons, the light weapons that they did have to protect themselves, so they were therefore, from that point on, deemed defenceless, and totally relied on the United Nations. And it gets even worse, because the United Nations had the authority to call for airstrikes by NATO, who were just around the corner, and for some reason, and it's not totally clear, but for some reason those airstrikes never happened. So those are some of the key things, as well as the personal issues, which are absolutely huge.
Yeah, thanks for that background. I mean, Alex, that's the kind of immediate background to the massacre. But of course, this took place in the process of the previously unitary Yugoslav state unravelling. And do you think that the Western powers have some responsibility for that, given that it was Germany's decision to recognise Slovenia as an independent state, which started off the domino process of the unravelling of what was, whatever our criticisms might be of it, a functioning multi-ethnic state?
Yes, without going into some huge detail about it, I think that there was an interest by Europe, by NATO, which was trying to seek some justification for its existence after the Cold War, in encouraging the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. Obviously, this was combined with nationalist and like social sentiment to do so. So I think it's very hard to come down on one side or the other on this. It has, as a result, though, of, I think, because of the fact there were these underlying tensions, regardless of the outcome, it is often raised by a lot of people as a sort of the linchpin of liberal intervention, sort of eternal justification in future, which is because we missed the atrocities in Srebrenica, we can't allow this to happen again. Therefore, there have been interventions in Kosovo, in Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Iraq, and regardless of your views on any of those conflicts, I think Bosnia, and particularly Srebrenica, was, I think, in combination with Rwanda, a crucial underpinning of that. But of course, one of the issues, I think, when it comes to, say, imperialist interests in former Yugoslavia, is that imperialism, of course, isn't moralistic, and it's very hard to say whether, in spite of imperial ambitions, it was nevertheless somehow the wrong thing for Europe and the US to get involved, because there were atrocities there. And of course, it's still debatable how much the eventual interventions in the former Yugoslavia actually did have, but a lot of people could, with some justification, argue that it did put a stop to what could have been greater atrocities. But of course, that's going to be debated for a lot of years to come.
Well, we'll come back to some of those points in a minute. But Nasir, first of all, in terms of the after effects and the kind of political responsibility that people bear for this, of course, we tend to talk about closure here, but there can't really be for the individuals who lost people in that. But in a political sense, is that anywhere near happening, or is there still a great deal of unfinished business?
I think that there is a lot of unfinished business, and I don't think it's terribly complicated. I think the Bosnian people have shown themselves to be incredibly tolerant people. They've waited and waited and waited for justice. They haven't taken matters into their own hands. They believe in the international judicial system, but it's been incredibly slow. It's now 20 years, and we still have the main figures. We have Mladic and Karadzic still going through the courts. They're still not being convicted 20 years on. However, it is happening, so there is something positive in that. I think for the families who have gone through this atrocity. Sometimes it's a case of their loved ones were taken away from them. Sometimes they were killed in front of them. So when they go through this, it's not something they're going to forget. They can't forget it, but they are after justice. Now I think there's a couple of ways that they would be looking for justice, and that might settle it for them. One of those is the process that's going on this weekend, which is the 11th of July, where there are mass burials every year of newly identified victims. Now, when they get told, the most they can expect is, your father or your son's DNA was matched to a couple of bones, and there we are, you can do a burial. But that means a lot to them. They can now do a ceremonial burial and try to put those feelings away and say, right, it's now closed. But that's not the complete closure, as they will tell you. The other side of it is many people, many Bosniaks actually know and recognise people who committed some of those horrendous crimes and who still have jobs within the state, sometimes even in the police force, freely working away, and have not been put away to justice. We've captured some of the really big figures, and that's symbolic, but that's excellent, that's finally been done. But we haven't. The people who carried out these atrocities that are recognised, really it's a huge exercise to try and put them away to justice. How can you say, I've forgotten, fine, you killed my dad, but you're still out there, you've not been punished for it. If they see them being punished, I think that would close it for them.
I mean, Alex, you were alluding to the fact that the Balkan War and the need for intervention was used as a sort of the beginning of the argument about humanitarian intervention, famously by Tony Blair, of course. And in the report, we linked that with contemporary Islamophobic sentiment in Europe. But of course, the irony is that it was the war has begun under the pretext of we can't allow Srebrenica again, that led to the modern spread of Islamophobia as a result of the intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq. How would you unpick that sort of timeline?
Well, I think it's very interesting is one sort of commonly accepted one thing people try to differentiate between the Balkans War and contemporary Islamophobia is to argue that what happened in the Balkans in Bosnia was an ethnic conflict, and that Bosnian Muslims formed an ethnic group rather than a religious group. Now, of course, those two things are tremendously hard to sort of differentiate between in many circumstances. And of course, Bosnian Muslims are overwhelmingly secular compared to many other countries, compared to a lot of Muslims in this country. Having said that, what's very interesting and what I think doesn't get brought up a lot is that one of the justifications used by Serb forces, by people like Karadzic, when they were trying to stir up propaganda against Bosnian Muslims, was to argue that Izetbegovic, Ali Izetbegovic, the Bosniak leader, was looking to create an Islamic republic like Iran in Bosnia, and had sort of alluded to some stuff he'd written as a student about this. So those same sort of elements were there when using that context as they are now. I think a lot of the same people who, shall we say, were in favour of intervention in Bosnia at the time, who are now seen as being sort of proponents of Islamophobia, would still go for the previous argument. That is, the Bosnian Muslim identity is not about religion, it was about race. Former Yugoslavia, everyone's tremendously secular. It's possible to be a Bosnian Muslim atheist, which I think probably is true. But at the same time, because I don't think contemporary Islamophobia is all about religion either, I think there is a lot of parallels you can draw there. And I do think it's ironic that the same people who call for intervention then are often the same people stoking Islamophobia now.
Yeah, it's a peculiar contradiction, isn't it? Paradox.
I'd just like to add something to that. It's interesting, we're talking about ethnicities and religions, and they're all kind of intertwined here, but we've really got three groups. We had three groups there. We had the Serbs, the Croats, and who were described as the Bosniaks, synonymous with Muslims, but ethnically, actually, they weren't very different at all. In fact, they came from the same, one chose one religion and another group had a, same language, and in fact, there was such a closely knit community. They lived together. They went to each. It's known that they went to each other's places of worship. So they were actually very close. The only difference, as you say, is primarily language and name. Sorry, language is the same. The names were different. So they were actually very close. And despite possibly some of Izetbegovic's earlier comments, Bosnia had never asked for an independent state for Muslims. Never. Not from the beginning of this. Bosnia wanted an integrated, independent nation of those who had acquired Bosnian nationality, consisting of Bosnians, Croats and Serbs. And at that time, they were actually a fairly even mix. There was a majority of Muslims, but not by a huge amount. So that's what actually the Bosnians were asking for. They were never asking for a Muslim state. They were asking for a combined independent Bosnia. And it's interesting on that front, you'll hear about heroic Serbs who actually helped to defend Bosnia from the Serbs, and so the Serbs who actually had a Bosnian identity, but Bosnian Serbs who actually fought alongside the Muslims. So it wasn't a complete, one against the other.
OK, well, we'll have to leave it there, but we are coming back to this subject after the break. But do join us then, and we'll be looking at the event held in the East London Mosque to commemorate the victims of Srebrenica and the rest of the day's news. That's after the break.